Welcome to Femme and Furious, a podcast where pop culture meets a feminine framing. I am your host, Julia Rose Portella, and today we are going to see just how femme and furious we can get as we rev up to whip around the curves of culture. But before we dive in deep, I'm going to need you to call me, beat me, if you want to reach me. And you can do so by subscribing to the podcast on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also watch a full video breakdown on YouTube. You can follow the podcast over on Instagram at FemmeandFuriousPod. Or if you have thoughts, opinions, feelings about today's episode, or perhaps you have thoughts, opinions, feelings, maybe even theories about season 2 of The Last of Us, you can send me an email over at femmeandfuriouspod@gmail.com. You can also join our community. It's called Too Femme, Too Furious over on Patreon. It's $10 a month, and it gets you Femme and Furious fully loaded bonus episodes, 15% off discount merch, and live events. It gets you access to Sunday Brunch, which is a monthly virtual hangout, ad-free episodes. You are granted the Suffragette Award, which gives you voting privileges on episode topics and bonus content and more. You also get access to Tea Time, which is our online chat, and Fast Five, because we love a Fast and Furious reference over here on Femme and Furious podcast, which is a weekly content roundup. So right now, the Fast Five that I have going on are Screen Queens, Mistress of Music, Ladies Who Listen, Viral Vixens, and Bookish Baddies. So you will see what I'm watching, reading, listening to that week, and I hope that you guys will join in and send me what you guys are listening to, watching, reading, etc. And so that's a nice little way for us to connect every week. That is over on the Patreon. Last but not least, I am having a free launch party this weekend, Saturday, April 12th at 11 a.m. You can join over on Zoom through the link in my show notes. I will have prizes. I will have games. We will hang out and just celebrate in community together this new venture for me and for all of us as a community. I hope to see you there. All right, babies, let's dive into our femme frame today. Curves in culture. So I'm not sure about you listening, but I am a millennial woman, which means that I have had the unique experience of allowing my frontal lobe to develop during the 90s and early aughts when beautiful celebrities like Kate Winslet and Jessica Simpson were considered fat, but I came into my body and my sexuality in the later 2000s when celebrities like the Kardashians rose to fame and put curvy in style. Flash forward to 2025, where the tides of culture are changing over once more, as they always do, and all of these 90s fashions are reemerging, bringing with it a barrage of straight and narrow clothing, which directly conflicts with the perfectly curated curve culture that has accompanied the last 15 years or so. And when I started to reflect on this, I realized that this is actually a pretty common trend that has tracked for decades. Just about every 20 years, a little bit less than that, the idea of body image and what is considered couture fluctuates between ultra thin and curvy. And I want to preface this episode with saying this is a very Western look, very American look at what we are going to talk about today. I know this is not the case for all cultures. We'll talk a little bit about that in the podcast, but I want to sort of put that up top. This is a very Westernized conversation, okay? And a second little sidebar. I grew up playing the Her Interactive Nancy Drew video games. We're a niche bunch, but if you know, you know. Also, 2 of my 3 cats are named Sherlock and Watson. So if you couldn't deduce what I'm getting at, I love puzzles. I love patterns. It's why I chronically revisit material that I've watched or read, because I absolutely love to choose something over and to take my time to digest it. Curves and femininity in relation to culture is one of those things that I keep chewing because there is so much to this conversation. It's more multi-layered than a tiramisu. And when I look at how these trends oscillate between thin and curvy, I can't help but note the economic, historical, and religious implications around our idea of femininity, and particularly how this has translated into curve culture. So let's dive into the herstory of curves through the decades. As much as I would love to go back and start from the early 1900s, I'm going to start us at this conversation in the 1920s, because I just want to think about the flapper dress. And for those of you who are listening at home, you may want to watch the video coverage over on Spotify or pop over to YouTube to see a picture of me dressed as a flapper from my freshman year of college. And for those of you watching, you're welcome. The style of the 1920s, if we can summarize it by just the flapper dress alone, was very straight and narrow. So let's take a look at what was happening in the history and the economics of the 20s and the 30s, because it really highlights a lot of the foundational patterns that we will see around curve culture moving forward. If we're just going off vibes alone, the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote, only happened in 1919, and it wasn't officially established in the Constitution until August of 1920. And this newfound independence for women was reflected in more liberal clothing, shorter hemlines, lower necklines, naked shoulders. And again, very narrow, not hugging up on the curves. But there were some other pieces of history, namely World War I, that also influenced curve culture. So on one hand, women gained this incredible freedom, and the early 1920s fashion almost acts as a reflection of a rejection of curve culture, almost as if women are trying to separate themselves from hyper-femininity and redefine it in order to be more aligned with this newfound freedom. But it becomes much harder to tell because there is so much historic and economic devastation from World War I that it almost negates the sentiment, because in general, clothing, food, and other resources were scarce, making it much more likely that curve culture was also being deeply impacted by the state of the world. Both can obviously be true, but it's just something to think about as we move into the late 30s and then into the 40s. Because as the decade changed over, there was a wave of division amongst women. The early 40s introduced us to Rosie the Riveter, an icon that we still adore today. She's strong. She has really lovely, strong, toned arms. She's the kind of arms that you write smut about, okay? But think about it. This poster comes out in 1942, not long after the end of the Depression. Poverty is still running rampant at this time. Tons of people are still eating from soup kitchens. And women have already been forced into the workplace in the 30s to supplement income because so many households were devastated by the financial crisis of the 30s. So as the threat of World War II hangs over American heads, Rosie wasn't just created as this great American feminist icon. She actually really didn't become a feminist icon until the 70s. In the 40s, she was just propaganda to keep women enthusiastic about working, since we were shipping men off to war and we needed bodies to fill those roles. So we have this great period of time where women are just gaining liberties that they didn't have before. We have the 20s, which gave women the right to vote, and then we have the 30s and 40s, which introduced women into the workforce. And this is where I want to gently mention religion. My day job is doing tarot and astrology, which I recognize is not secular, but I find that people turn to me and to these modalities the same way that they turn to religion. And that is often in the time of crisis. COVID was one of the busiest times that I've ever experienced for doing readings. People seek the comfort of God or source or the universe or whatever you want to call it during times of major stress. So if you think about the trajectory of World War I, which led to the Depression, which led to World War II, and all of that is crisis that brings people to religion. which is why, in my opinion, there is a tie between fascism and Christian nationalism. But I digress. This bridges us to the later part of the decade. World War II ends in 1945, and consequently then, women are pushed out of the workforce so their jobs could be given to returning servicemen. And then, just 2 years later, Christian Dior releases his first collection titled Carole. In America, this would be called the New Look. And it takes away that straight and narrow look from the 20s and 30s and begins to reintroduce the hourglass figure in a more prominent way. The New Look had more rounded shoulders, it cinched at the waist, and it was completed with a long skirt. So now women, as a collective, are taking a societal step back because they're being pushed out of the workplace, and then, shortly after that, curve culture starts to take root once more. And it's not like women were objectively all agreed on the issues of curves and femininity. As women gained more freedoms, some women felt that it was backtracking to go back to this dainty feminine look. Other women were so used to rationing that it just felt wasteful to use so much fabric to create the long skirts when the world was still recovering from the Depression and the war. In all scenarios, it seems that women were divided on what is deemed a feminine body type. Personally, I love the fashion of the 40s, and I often find myself drooling over it when I watch movies or TVs centered in that period of time. I think of actresses like Katharine Hepburn, who looked equally stunning in the utilitarian pantsuits as she did when she donned the New Look. Genuinely, the 40s has some of the fashion I adore most in the world. But it is a shifting back into curve culture. And that brings us to the fashion or the curve culture in the 50s, where the hourglass silhouette gets even more exaggerated, and the va-va-voom, voluptuous curves are all the way in. And this exaggeration of hyper-femininity comes on the heels of decades-long societal shifts that have granted women more freedoms. The 20s, again, the right to vote, the 30s, and especially the 40s, pushing women into the workplace, and then once all of the world issues end, the Depression is over, the wars are over, this idea of the happy homemaker emerges. Does that sound familiar to you? If it doesn't, listen on. We come to the end of the decade in the 50s, just about ready to enter the 60s, and suddenly designers like Balenciaga and Givenchy create fashions that were more straight and focused on emphasizing a woman's natural shape, not through cinching the waist, but at letting tops and jackets only go so far as the waistline to draw attention without overemphasizing. And this fashion gains traction as the 60s begin, and then thin is in again. So we get this nearly 15-year trajectory of curve culture being in. The 60s brought us actresses like Twiggy and Audrey Hepburn, who were huge feminine icons, and are stunning, by the way, yet they're often seen wearing the more shapeless style of the 60s. I guess now is a good time as any to say I'm obviously not a fashion expert, but I enjoy looking at the societal constructs that have shaped femininity and our understanding of it over time. So I will preface this next piece by saying the 70s and 80s are like, fuck it if I know, decades. Having not lived through them myself, I would say that the 70s and 80s fashion iconography always feels more poignant in that fashion always seems to feel a little bit more liberated from trends of the other decades. Again, this is just my perception because the 70s on one hand had fashion that mimicked the 30s, but on the other hand you had disco, hip huggers, bold evening wear, some of the best evening wear in the 70s, and you had women like Donna Summer who promoted sensuality. amongst women. And you had a stronger presence of queer culture that was taking root in society. And I guess like if we're discussing curves, I would say that big boobs were also more promoted in the 70s because you had actresses like Farrah Fawcett, who was the epitome of beauty because she's not too petite, she's athletic, but she had a nice bust. Athleticism was generally more promoted in the 70s as like an ideal body type for women. And that sort of thing brings back Rosie the Riveter, where her strong, toned arms become somewhat of the icon for feminism in the 70s. And like, no wonder she became this feminist icon 30 years later, because it's when her body type was more prominently valued. And then in the 80s, I don't know, we had like pencil skirts and blazers, but it's also the beginning of women wearing athleisure wear as like regular everyday clothing, jazzercise. And it's like the more that women are gaining freedoms over the decades, the less the pendulum swings from this ultra curvy to ultra thin. And that brings us to the 90s, where femininity once again gets sort of divided down the middle, but this time it's less around weight and more around aesthetic. So the 90s brought in like bright Barbie, pop, neon pink, and then there was like grunge. Like you existed in one of those two categories. But in all cases, that straight, narrow expression is what is being embodied. Everything in the 90s was about being thin. Like, for fuck's sake, one of the most popular styles was called heroin chic, which would be cool if heroin was describing a strong female lead and not the drug, because it makes you skinny and sunken in. Heroin chic. One of my favorite movies is Bridget Jones. And as a child of the 90s, I specifically remember her being considered a fat character or a curvy character. Meanwhile, now I'm in my 30s and I look at her and I watch the movie and I'm like, so she's normal sized? Question mark. The 90s emphasized thinness as an ideal of beauty and femininity, and it was backed by a diet culture so toxic that all of us who were raised in it probably need therapy from our body dysmorphia. Phrases like, a moment on the lips is a lifetime on the hips, or nothing tastes as good as skinny feels, bullied women into submission, and some god-awful slip dresses. And that brings us to somewhat current times. The trend towards curvy began to shift in the 2010s, and it really starts to change things, in my opinion. And a lot of that was due to the internet. First of all, the introduction of social media started establishing a new type of celebrity. The Kardashians rise to fame, and they were the beauty icons, the standard for the 2010s, leading trends not just in body size and type and shape, but also in makeup and in fashion. Suddenly, big hips are back in. People are lining up to get BBLs. High-waisted couture reemerges and brings an emphasis to curves again. Like, imagine now, in today's fashion, trying to fit your big hips and your BBLs into those slip dresses that have reemerged. It's a comedy routine. It's funny. You should think about that and chuckle. Social media also brought a new wave of body positivity. Because it wasn't actually about body positivity anymore. It became more about anti-body shaming in general in any direction. I think about songs like Mika's Big Girl, You Are Beautiful, and Meghan Trainor's All About the Bass, which were pop hits in the 2010s. But because the pendulum between curvy and thin continues to rotate about every 15 to 20 years, when we've brushed up against body positivity in the past, it has always leaned towards fat acceptance. The 2010s opened up this conversation to a much larger conversation under the umbrella of feminism and about body perception and about the male gaze. It let mid-size become mainstream. Artists like Lizzo win the heart of the public, and she goes on to create an inclusive shapewear line. And she does all of this while she is focusing on getting her body to a place that feels good and comfortable for her. Now, I also cannot in good conscience discuss the modern wave of body positivity in feminism without including diversity, especially when considering the influence of the LGBTQ community. In my opinion, a good part of why we've started to reshape body image as a direct correlation to our femininity is because our understanding of what a woman is has widened in the past decade. The pendulum can't swing as drastically when the idea of femininity continues to expand. Truly, there's no difference in womanhood between me and a trans woman and anyone who considers themselves femme and anyone who defines gender normativity. We may all have different body types, but we're all women. The only discrepancy is the perception of femininity as a societal construct. And we can't even clearly define that among cis women, spanning decades. So this new idea or introduction of new people into this conversation of what a woman is giving us more room to discuss where body type fits into the experience of curve culture and femininity. And a huge push of this came during the more recent years. The past few years online, women and gender nonconforming people stepping forward to dismantle the patriarchy, one get ready with me video at a time. Specifically, like Anna Kai comes to mind here. And she's an influencer who does these incredible beauty videos that are overlaid with conversations about women's empowerment or modern dating. And this isn't just with beauty or body positivity. Diversity has made everything so much more digestible. Though I think the broadening of horizons around what curve culture is correct at any given moment in time has helped so many women, queer, and gender nonconforming folks recognize that body and beauty are not synonymous. And while so many Western cultures continue to seesaw between stick thin and thick as fuck, in the past 15 years, social media has allowed us to diversify our For You pages. It has completely changed the way that we navigate conversations around femininity and beauty standards, because it's the first time in history that we have access to the entire world at the touch of our fingertips. And while social media and the internet has many pitfalls, one incredible perk, is that these platforms have allowed so many different cultural norms to surface and therefore expand our purview of what we deem normal. I have seen so many indigenous influencers emerge and help redefine gender binaries. I've seen beautiful Samoan women flaunt their curves. I've seen petite Korean women. I've seen celebrities like Bella Ramsey wear non-binary clothing brands like Both And. In short, as my For You page has diversified, truly so has my understanding of my own body and femininity. And it's not just me. This is a rising movement in the online spaces that is promoting not just body positivity, but body acceptance, body reclamation, body joy, body love. And this, unfortunately, is mostly in relation to men. The 2010s also had incredible surges of feminist movements, including Hands Off and Me Too. That's not coincidental. And now look at where we are. 2025. Just experienced a major global pandemic, and we are still in the economic impact that has had. And what has happened in relation to that? There has been a rise in right-wing ideation all over the world, and specifically here in America. There has been a rise in Christian nationalism. And that preferred conservative style for women is tradwife, where the clothing skews more towards curve emphasis and echoes the 1950s and tends to be a little bit more modest. And of course, the women with those views adopt that kind of style. But what does the rest of the pop culture landscape do? It rejects this notion, even though curvy has been in a majority of my adult life. Suddenly, body-inclusive influencers are now all on Ozempic. The thin is in, 90s couture has re-emerged. And we're challenging the idea of what femininity actually is. And more subtly, perhaps, challenging why there is a rejection of this as conservative values rise. Still, the idea of femininity resting solely on whatever curve preference is in style is slowly starting to fade. It's not gone, it's not eradicated, but it is an ongoing conversation in relation to racial, cultural, and gender diversity. And listen, we're still divided on this. Women and men and gender-bending folks alike can't quite settle on this, and I doubt that we ever will in full. But I know that personally, the thin style came back and I was outraged. I've spent years refining my curves only for them to become somewhat obsolete in the fashion world. And between the trend changing so drastically and then entering my 30s around the same time, it was hard to navigate that nothing really fit my body anymore. This idea of femininity and desirability being attached to a certain body type seems like psychological warfare, because these are goalposts that are ever changing and obviously have the ability to be impacted so profoundly by the world around us, just like they were in the 20s and 30s. But in doing this podcast and in examining some of the historic trends just a little bit more closely, if we look at there being a rejection of curve culture as perhaps a reclamation of the idea of femininity as it relates to men, okay, yeah, I can get behind that. Again, is this exactly how the world works? No. But if the past rejection of curve culture has been in correlation to a rise in conservative views after a period of time of exponential growth for women's equality, then I would say the reemergence of 90s fashion is perhaps more closely connected to the rise in extreme right rhetoric that has been happening around women and queer folks, and more importantly, around their bodily autonomy. Especially as this trend of straight and narrow clothing is coming out of a time when we have just had the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And we have a group of men leading this country who have been mostly accused of sexual assault and pose a very serious threat to women and femfolk alike. We are also at a period of time where we have had extreme economic devastation. And as women have grown more vocal, more independent, more outraged, men are tending to become more conservative. Because consciously or not, there is a recognition that during periods of time where curve culture is being rejected, are periods of time when women are pushing for or being granted rights that they didn't have before, just like in the 20s. Now, I'm probably getting ahead of myself because this is such a nuanced conversation, but it seems to me like so many women and femme folks are starting to have this conversation around femininity, but instead of it being centered around the preference of men, our diversifying of societal understanding of what feminine is has allowed us to actually have this conversation together in spite of men. This is why there is a rising number of women who do not want to get married or have children, especially within my generation, millennials, And also, on the other hand, a rising consideration of what is being called like the men's loneliness epidemic. And there's obviously other things that filter into it. But is it not coincidental that women have, even with the overturning of Roe versus Wade, the most rights we have ever been granted? We can have our own money. We can have our own houses. We can have as many cats as we would like to adopt. This is a period of time that is now allowing women to then break with the idea of strictly defaulting into more normative roles, including with our clothing and our body type. I like that we live in a time where we can start having these conversations more deeply. And I like that despite the rising right-wing rhetoric, say that 10 times fast, we live in a time where we can see beautiful and diverse women at the swipe of our screens. I like that we can find community and support right online. And I like that all of this allows for the idea of femininity to become less of a societal norm and more of a personal one. All right. We can go on and on about this topic, and I guarantee it's not the last time that we will talk about body image and femininity and curves on this podcast. But for now, let's hit pause and crack open our burn book so that we can look at our superlatives for this week. The Bold and Bothered Award goes to influencer Anna Kai, who wins this one for her brilliant Get Ready With Me videos, where she often dives into dismantling stereotypes and dating culture behavior. She genuinely is enchanting to watch. Our Shiro Award, Audrey Hepburn. She wins this one for me. She has iconic quotes like, "Paris is always a good idea," which I couldn't agree with more. And then she has other quotes like, "I believe in pink. I believe that laughing is the best calorie burner. I believe in kissing a lot," which is just perfection. The Femme Fatale Award goes to Katharine Hepburn, who once said that if you obey all the rules, you will miss all the fun. Chef's kiss. Speak Your Truth trophy. I'm giving this one to Bridget Jones because she maybe has one of the most impactful lines for my youth that I didn't understand until I was much older. So, spoilers for Bridget Jones. If you've never seen the movie and you don't want to be spoiled, you can just hit the 15-second button and skip ahead. When Daniel Cleaver says, "If I can't make it with you, I can't make it with anybody," he's being the biggest dick. It sounds like a compliment. It's the biggest backhanded compliment ever. It's a diss. Okay, he's being such a dick in this moment. And what does she say back to him? "That's not a good enough offer for me." Boom. Iconic. Perfection. No notes. Honorary heartthrob. Obviously, Rosie the Riveter. Thank you for tuning into this week's episode of Femme and Furious. If you liked this week's episode, share it out with your friends. Maybe leave a review so that other like-minded ladies can find the pod. And if you're watching The Last of Us Part 2, I will see you here on Monday for our deep dive coverage. Until then, go and give your body some love.